good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Dialogues on Poetics. My name is Michael Nardone. I'm here at Anteism Books here in Montreal. This is a kind of ad hoc series where I'm working through with different writers, artists, editors, theorists, and we're discussing issues in contemporary poetics. And we're focusing on and I'm going to use my interlocutor today's words for this, the tension between poetry as poetics as a theory of poetry, its forms, histories, critical categories, and poetics as a theory of poesis making, a larger field that extends beyond the boundaries of poetry as a specific literary activity, which I think is an interesting framing today for thinking about the issues in poetics we'll be talking with today. That quote actually comes from the introduction to the series that I edit with Nathan Brown, who's joining us today, the documents on Expanded Poetics that we publish here with Anteism Books. So first off, I'd like to thank Nathan Brown for joining me here today. I'd also like to thank Yoav and Madeline and Pascal, who are doing the production at Anteism Books. We're figuring out this broadcast infrastructure right now, so it's like it's an experiment, and hopefully everything will come together in a good way today. I'll read Nathan's bio. To start things off, Nathan Brown is Associate Professor of English and Canada Research Chair in Poetics at Concordia University, where he directs the Center for Expanded Poetics. He is the author of The Limits of Fabrication, Material Science, and Materialist Poetics, and also the book that we're here to discuss and celebrate today, Rationalist Empiricism, A Theory of Speculative Critique. Also with Peter Milot, he is co-editor of 2 volumes, The Art of the Concept and Poesis, which is a really, really beautiful book I have here today, published by Mama in Zagreb. Also, we'll discuss today Nathan's forthcoming projects too, a translation of Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, alongside of a book-length essay on Baudelaire, Baudelaire's Shadow, an essay on poetic determination, which will be published this fall. On a personal note, I guess I've known Nathan now for 8 years that he's been based in Montreal. I think of him as a mentor and friend, as do I know a lot of us in Montreal and beyond. I'm thankful for his presence and his incredible level of critique and all that he helps to materialize here in terms of literary infrastructure in Montreal. It's like been an exceptional thing having him a part of this community for a number of years. Yeah, and I'm amazed by the book that we'll be talking about today, Rationalist Empiricism. I'm not somebody who necessarily is centered within philosophical discourses, though I definitely pay attention to them. I'm working in an adjacent field in terms of literary studies and poetics, but this seems like a major intervention in contemporary philosophy. And tomorrow, for those of you who want to hear Nathan discuss the more like focus on the core, the kernel philosophical concepts that are at the heart of this book, Nathan's going to be the focus of a symposium tomorrow at Harvard, Harvard's Mahindra Institute for the Humanities. We'll put a link up in the YouTube feed shortly for that. And also, I want to point people to an incredible book launch that happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago. That's also up on YouTube. That was led by Stephen Ross, a member of the Center for Expanded Poetics. Did an incredible book launch with Nathan a few weeks ago, and it's a really exceptional overview and introduction to the philosophical chapters of this book. Yeah, so first off, welcome, Nathan.
Well, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. And, you know, I could say many of the same things about you, that since moving to Montreal, you know, I couldn't have oriented myself to many of the things going on here without, without your help and without your influence and without your collaboration. So it's been a real pleasure working with you.
That's great. Thank you. So I've asked Nathan to do a sort of like introduction to rationalist empiricism, and to help us navigate, you know, what the book is, what the book's doing, what it's speaking to, and I also really wanted Nathan to read from the book. He's introduced the books a couple of times, but I really like. Nathan's an incredible writer, and I want people to experience the actual granularity of the text and of the writing, and to hear how the thinking is materialized in the language itself of the book. So I've asked Nathan to do that, and then we'll open it up to dialogue, or not open it up. He and I will engage in a dialogue afterwards on the book.
Great. Well, again, thanks so much for the introduction. And yeah, I'll just begin by saying a few words about the genesis of this book project, and what the goals of the book are, and the intervention that I attempt to make. And then I will read a passage from the beginning of chapter 1 of the book. So this is very much a book that stems from an engagement with a theoretical community, with a group of graduate students and theorists, while I was at UCLA, and also at these conferences at Cornell in the early 2000s, run by the Cornell Theory Reading Group. And I think that what we were really concerned with in that group was the relationship of contemporary French philosophy to post-Kantian German philosophy. How to think about, let's say, the results of the sequence of French philosophy since the 1950s and its relation to figures like Kant and Hegel and Marx. And at the same time, throughout the humanities, I think, there was a lot of debate about the relationship between speculation and critique, and a sort of critique of critique itself in the Kantian sense. That is, Kant's attempt, for which he's known in the history of philosophy, to set the limits of the legitimate use of what he calls pure reason, and to set the limits of, let's say, valid philosophical discourse. And there was a kind of resistance to that critical project or critical disposition, and a lot of polemics against critique in the name of speculation. And what I wanted to think through, well, first of all, was just what was at stake in this debate, but also how critique and speculation might be held together in a way that doesn't cancel the imperatives of either one. So I started thinking about that philosophically in the following terms, that Kant's intervention in philosophy was really to displace the opposition between rationalist and empiricist approaches to philosophy that foregrounded the priority of either reason or experience. And the question for me became, okay, well, if a certain critique of Kant is going to be carried out in contemporary philosophy, how does that bear upon Kant's own displacement of the opposition between rationalism and empiricism? And what I thought to myself is, okay, it reopens this question. We need to pose anew then the question of how rationalism and empiricism are related to one another if we're going to carry out a critique of Kant's solutions to that question of Kant's transcendental philosophy. So then what I try to do in the book is working between philosophy, also politics, particularly Marxist politics, but also chapters on scientific epistemology, scientific knowledge, scientific experimentation, and also on the art practice of a particular Montreal artist, in fact, Nicolas Bayer, who works with digital photography. And across those fields, I tried to think about the way in which, if we open up the relation between reason and experience, such that we don't try to ground it in a sort of ground once and for all, like the framework of Kant's transcendental philosophy, then there's a historical process, a kind of dialectical process whereby the imperatives of reason and experience interact with one another, interrupt one another, push one another further, and subject one another to critique. So I started thinking about what I call this disjunctive relation between rationalism and empiricism, whereby they're held apart, but also then are capable of interrupting one another and pushing one another further as a way of thinking about the relation between speculation and critique. So that's really the broad project of the book. And in the book, I work across chapters on Descartes and Hume, some chapters on Hegel, some chapters on Quentin Meillassoux, and also Louis Althusser, chapters on Alain Badiou, on Marx, on the French communist group, Thierry Communiste, and as I said, the artist Nicolas Bayer. So I can read a little bit as you suggested, from the beginning of the first chapter. The first chapter is titled Absent Blue Wax, on the mingling of methodological exceptions. And it's a chapter on Descartes and Hume, whereby I try to isolate an empiricist exception in Descartes and a rationalist exception in Hume. And I try to think about how those exceptions might sort of mingle on the outside of those rationalist and empiricist philosophical systems. And so that's what this opening passage is about. If philosophy involves the creation of concepts, it is the systematic character of philosophical thought that enables it to function as such. The statement and defense of a philosophical position through argument does not amount to the articulation of a philosophy, because every philosophy must construct not only arguments, but the very concepts through which those arguments may be understood. Such construction requires a systematic determination of concepts, wherein the meaning and the functions any concept acquire rely upon and support the meaning and functions of other concepts that together constitute the singular thought of a philosopher. The positions of philosophers like Descartes or Hume or Spinoza or Kant or Hegel are not thereby incommensurable with one another, but their commensurability must itself be constructed through an understanding of each one's thought, which grasps the systematicity of its determinations, thus relating concepts to one another. So for example, a concept like idea, through the specificity they acquire in each system, rather than through the assumption of a common terrain of positions that they commonly inhabit. Philosophical systems must be made to communicate, not so much at the interface of the common words they deploy, but through a paradoxical subsumption of our own thinking into the interior of their conceptual relationships, from within which we have to think toward the interiority of another system that we must also inhabit. So philosophical communication suggests a strange topology, wherein the exteriority of thought, the possibility that we may think one philosopher with another, is encountered within the deepest recesses of systems that would seem to shelter the specificity of their concepts from one another, that would seem to require us to remain within the immanent regulation of their terms in order to think those terms at all. Alfred North Whitehead defines speculative philosophy as what he calls the endeavor to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted. So here, coherence, he stipulates, means that the fundamental ideas in terms of which the scheme is developed presuppose each other, so that in isolation they are meaningless. Thus, he says, it's the ideal of speculative philosophy that its fundamental notions shall not seem capable of abstraction from one another. So this ideal involves the invention of concepts in the manner that I just discussed. It doesn't mean that these concepts will be definable in terms of one another. Rather, it means, as Whitehead says, that what is indefinable in one such notion cannot be abstracted from its relevance to other notions. So it's the indetermination haunting all individual words that finds its support in the case of philosophical concepts through the interdetermination of concepts that can never be wholly defined because they have to be thought through their relational coherence. Whitehead uses the term applicable, and what he means is that, he says, some terms of experience are thus interpretable through a speculative scheme, while the word adequate means that there are not items that are incapable of such interpretation. So the speculative scope of philosophy is potentially applicable to all items of experience. Whitehead thus makes the important comment that his ideal of speculative philosophy has what he calls a rational side and its empirical side. He says, The rational side is expressed by the terms coherent and logical. The empirical side is expressed by the terms applicable and adequate. But the two sides are bound together by clearing away an ambiguity which remains in the previous explanation of the term adequate. The adequacy of a scheme over every item does not mean that adequacy over such items as happen to have been considered. It means that the texture of observed experience, as illustrating the philosophic scheme, is such that all related experience must exhibit the same texture. So what are the consequences of this idea? It's not only the rational coherence of a scheme of concepts or fundamental ideas that is at issue in philosophical systematicity. The very interpretation of our experience is bound up, insofar as we enter into the thinking of a philosophical system with the intra-systemic determination of its concepts. The comparison of philosophical systems is, in this sense, not only an intellectual, historical, or analytical task, it's also a lived practice. We think and interpret the world that we inhabit through the ideas that we have at our disposal. And insofar as these are philosophical ideas, they are systematically articulated. Thus, our experience of the world enters into philosophical systematicity. And when we think across systems, we also attempt to carry out the improbable task of carrying our experience from one system into another. So what is the world that we pass through at the crux of concept and experience when we do that? Where is the extra-systematic space of philosophical reflection or of thought in which the compossibility or communication of philosophical systems takes place? Where and what is the world that we recompose as we compose that communication between systems?
Amazing.
So it's a complicated passage, but what I'm trying to think about is how we move between philosophical systems and the way in which then the imperatives of reason and experience differently traverse, a multiplicity of different ways of approaching philosophy across the history of modern philosophy in particular.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing this sort of situating of speculative thought in a ground that gets redefined or reconceptualized or rearticulated in every instance. And I want to specifically talk to that. One of the things, because you've had such rich discussions of the philosophical implications of this work, I'm interested in directing towards literary, theoretical, methodological questions. But I want to pause on a couple of things before we get there. And one of them is, Whitehead is somebody who is central in the passage that you just read, but a figure who's like this sort of overarching presence throughout the work is Bachelard. And you begin with the quote from Bachelard, and you return to him at the kind of coda or conclusion of the work as well. And I'm going to read the sort of epigraph to the work that comes up again. That starts at the introduction. Just because it's such a fascinating quote that I think haunts throughout the entire work. Empiricism and rationalism are bound in scientific thought by a strange bond, as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain. And that's from Bachelard's The Philosophy of No. So I'm just, I think of the latter Bachelard and the Poetics of Space and that figure, and I was really excited and interested in the fact that Bachelard showed up in thinking of this in thinking through the themes of this work. And can you say something about him?
Sure.
And his impress on you into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gaston Bachelard is a philosopher of science who had a huge influence on the whole generation of French philosophers, the post-war generation of French philosophers, and in particular on a kind of strain of scientific epistemology running through figures like Louis Althusser and Alain Badiou. And, that title of his book, La philosophie de non, the philosophy of no, is quite interesting, because what he means there is something like that reason and experience, rationalism and empiricism, can negate one another. So they need to inform one another, and they need to expose, let's say, their own criteria to one another, but they also need to negate and transform that criteria. And in that quotation, what I liked about that quotation from Bachelard's book is, first of all, his emphasis on the strange bond, the strangeness of the bond between rationalism and empiricism, or reason and experience. And I wanted to preserve that element of strangeness and try to think through it across the course of the book. The other thing that I got interested in is just, what exactly does he mean by this, a bond as strong as that which binds pleasure and pain? And, you know, it's a kind of throwaway remark by Bachelard. It's something that he says in passing. It's a metaphor. But it's also, if one takes it seriously, I think quite interesting. And I started to think about the way in which, well, maybe it's life that binds together pleasure and pain, because life is the condition of possibility for any affective experience at all, for any sensation. So even if pleasure and pain are different, or even if they enter into complex relations, life is the common condition of possibility for there to be pleasure or pain at all. So I thought then to myself, well, what is a bond as strong as that, which binds pleasure and pain, if that's life? And the way in which I try to answer this riddle in the conclusion of the book that you mentioned is by thinking of that in terms of technology. So that is to say, the way that in scientific experimentation, technical apparatuses are absolutely essential. Why? Because they displace the givenness of experience. Because they, or in Kantian terms, they displace the categories of our cognition that we bring to our experience. And they impose different constructions of experience upon the given. And that's why they're important for sort of filtering out the phenomenal immediacy of human experience. That doesn't mean that they're completely objective, but what it means is they can critique the lived experience or the lived phenomena of the human perceptual apparatus, and that they can also enter into a history of science that subjects previous results to negation and critique, etc. And so I thought, well, there's a way in which technology then it involves a kind of exteriority of thinking and of experience to the human being, and an exteriority of thinking and experience to life. So I think of that in terms of a kind of retroaction of thought upon life that then is aided and augmented by the sort of prosthetic apparatus of technology.
Is there a relation between technics and life, and rationalism and empiricism? Do you see these things like on, I mean, not on a similar plane, but the relation to one another similarly? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very complicated philosophical question, and also a complicated historical and scientific question. But let's say philosophically, I would say, you know, that matter is a condition of possibility for there to be life. And the organization of matter that we think of in terms of the organism or the living being is then also a condition of possibility for there to be something like thought. But there are also discontinuities between matter, life, and thought. And one thinker who's important to me in considering these questions is Bernard Stiegler. In particular, the first book of his series, Technics and Time, in which Stiegler argues that the development of technology and the development of thinking, the evolution of thought, and therefore of the human being, they're coeval. There's a coevolution of technology and the human. And the exteriorizations of experience and of thought that are made available by technology are the condition of possibility for the evolution of thinking. And so Stiegler, you know, develops a very interesting framework for thinking that through. But what's interesting there is that between, let's say, life and thought, there's an intervention. There's a crucial intervention of techniques that enables the sort of historicity of thinking through writing, and the development of thinking through technological exteriorization in ways that otherwise would have been impossible. And so technology is an inorganic, usually, organization of matter that changes the organic organization of matter, that makes new levels of thinking, the evolution of thinking possible, and that also makes scientific experimentation possible. So let's say there's a way in which technics makes possible an evolution of reason, but that it also changes the composition of experience and allows it to be configured in new ways that are so important for science.
Yeah. I mean, I was so excited to come upon that in the conclusion. I'll just note for listeners that there's a really surprising. I mean, I was surprised by the conclusion is this meditation on the true, the good, and the beautiful. The true is framed through an idea of an exploration of contingency. The good is framed through a critique of capitalism that I found just like such an incredible insertion of the concept of the good there, and the beautiful from the phenomenological engagement of that which exceeds or redefines the empirical or one's experience towards reconceptualizing the rational. And I found within these three themes this exploration of techniques to be fascinating because it's something that I'm working through in terms of thinking like literary theoretically, in terms of thinking of the expanse of poetics as necessarily dealing with inscriptive practices on that have writing on that think through writing on an array of registers and possibilities. I want to come back to that in a bit, thinking through the Center for Expanded Poetics.
Okay.
So I'm going to put a placeholder
Okay.
on that for now. But another thing that comes up in one of the chapters, and I don't think you've discussed it that much in the other scenarios in which you've discussed the book, is I was so thankful for your writings on théorie communiste, and they're a group of thinkers who I know are important, that I see reference, that I don't have an actual direct engagement with myself. But one of the things that I took away from your discussions and analysis of their work is the praxis of developing, theoretical, historical, pragmatic responses to occurrences, uprisings, insurgencies all over the world, and doing it from a ground that is like end capitalism, and yet the program of ending capitalism is perpetually reconfigured, and I think this is so excitingly integrated into the frame of this relationship between rationalism and empiricism in a really wonderful way. And so I'd love to hear you talk about what you found in Théorie Communiste, I'm curious how they've come in to influence your thinking in this book.
Great. Well, there's a chapter in the book on Marx, which offers a rereading of Volume 1 of Capital in particular. And I'll just say in that respect that one thing which is very important about Marxism, about historical materialism for this project, is that it constitutively involves a relationship between theory and practice. So it's extremely important that, let's say, you can't just have an edifice of Marxist theory which can't be transformed through the experience of political struggle, through political practice. So I try to think that through in a particular framework in that chapter. But within that broad, let's say, fact about Marxist theory and communist theory, Théorie communiste is a particularly interesting group, I think, because they really have a way of foregrounding the primacy of practice and its transformation of theory, what they call the theorizing character of struggles, in a way that I find very compelling. So they're a group that formed in Marseille, where they're still based, in the 1970s, came out of the context of debates about council communism and self-organization, particularly in the wake of May 68. And their journal, titled Théorie communiste, has been published since the mid-70s. And as you say, they very much have a practice of, let's say, analyzing particular struggles as they crop up and attempting to draw theoretical and historical conclusions from those struggles that might bear upon the way that we think about communist theory. And I think their real contribution to the history of communist theory is their effort to periodize the class struggle, so to periodize the class relation, and therefore the configuration of class struggle during different periods of capital, such that it's not a kind of invariant of the history of political struggle, but is rather something that is transformed, on the one hand, by transformations of the structure of capital, and on the other hand, transformed by the history of political struggles. And they have a very sophisticated, in my opinion, way of going about that form of analysis. So what's important to me about it in that chapter, which is about, on the one hand, Althusser and Théorie communiste, and I use it to criticize these sort of residual references to the concept of the whole in Althusser, which Pierre Macheret had already criticized in the 1960s, and which Althusser had admitted were sort of theoretically infelicitous. And I think that that the framework that Théorie communiste sets up allows us to think beyond and in continuity with the way that that Althusser was thinking about Marx and about communist theory. So that's the effort of that chapter.
Great. I mean, I find that part of me is excited about that because, one, I want to engage that body of writing and analysis and historicizing. And I also am engaged with the idea of like translating this kind of practice within thinking of the expanse or the practices of writing, you know, to really think about like what you know, to think about what forms of writing are, what they can do, what they can speak to, what they can anticipate, what they develop practices of or towards that can you know, resonate out of literary practices, and I find that to be a really incredible model. Yeah, so you know, one of the things that you haven't talked about in with regard to the book, as I said, is like thinking through the impact of what this book might mean for thinking through theoretical, literary, methodological things, practices, issues. Yeah, part of me is interested in, situating this to like how, like what does the figure of the rational empiricist, or what does a rational empiricist methodology look like in terms of literary theory? You know, I brought this up while we went for a walk the other day. Like, I'm interested in the figure in poetry of the rational empiricist,
Okay.
as well. I mean, it's like part of me wants to add qualities to this body of theory in a certain way. And so yeah, I'd love to hear you speak on this.
Sure. I mean, it's maybe a little bit odd that there's no engagement whatsoever, really, with literature in this book. But my writing of the book coincided with the completion of my first book, which is on science and poetry, and also in the final stages of writing the book with my formation of the Center for Expanded Poetics at Concordia, trying to, you know, create a research center that would open up an interdisciplinary approach to poetry and poetics, and put it into communication with work in the sciences, with the arts in general, and also with philosophy. And, you know, again, to go back to let's say, the sort of conjunctural intervention of the book. So there are debates in literary studies right now about the status of critique. Again, a kind of critique of critique, where critique is thought of as something like, let's say, the critique of ideology, or the discourse of suspicion that runs from Nietzsche through Freud, and also in Marx. And the alternative that's often put forward to critique in that vein, the critique of ideology, is a practice of description, let's say, that would foreground more the immediacy of our experience of literary texts. And actually, I think that both of these things are quite important, and that it's very important that neither of them cancel the other. So one of the wagers of the book is that this opposition between speculation and critique, or let's say empirical description, and sort of rational formalization or construction, that this is a false, a kind of specious opposition, which is not productive for contemporary philosophy or contemporary literary studies. But I think that one thing that's been important to me is that it's important to be, I often ask my students, describe this poem or describe this passage. I think that's a very important exercise. What do you see in this passage? Describe it. How does this work? Describe the operation of this poem. But on the other hand, we have to be able to analyze, and we have to be able to criticize the immediacy of our own experience of text. That is to say, we have to have a critique of ideology contributed by Marxism, and we also have to have a theory, I think, of the unconscious contributed by psychoanalysis that allows us to think of the way in which our experience itself has to be subjected to critique, that lived experience is not just something that we can rely upon as truth, but rather it has to inform our thinking and also enter into a dialectical relationship with critique. So, one way in which I think that can happen in literary studies is by working between disciplines.
Yep.
Whose book, Mad Science and Imperial City, I really revere, where Wang was a scientist who quit his job as a university professor and became a poet, actually in the wake of 9/11 and the sort of crackdown on civil liberties after 9/11. And he was also involved in political struggles in China in the 1980s in a way that profoundly informed his poetic practice.
He's based in the U.S.?
He's based in New York now, yeah, in Queens, I believe, still. And Shenxing Wang, he's someone who speaks about in his poetry formalizing his experience, even mathematically. So I did an interview with him, and he spoke about, I'm trying to figure this out mathematically, the way that I relate to my own experience of political struggle and in some cases political destitution. And the book is an incredible attempt to do this through the sort of poetic formalization of his scientific knowledge and the sort of relay between science and poetry that he's able to establish in that extraordinary book. And so there you can have, a way of deflecting the contents of one form of experience or one form of thinking through another. And I think that's something really crucial about interdisciplinarity. And the reason I think it often has to be mediated by philosophy is that philosophy gives us concepts for thinking about relations between disciplines. So, at the Center for Expanded Poetics, I try to set up forms of practice or relations between courses or relations between artistic practices that can move between the arts, the sciences, and literature in a way which is mediated by, by the formation of concepts. And that's a difficult and experimental process that's collaborative and that operates in all kinds of ways I would never have expected when I started that research center, through the relationship between the particular interests of students who get involved in it.
Yeah, and also the tying together of Anteism books, say, with the Center for Expanded Poetics, and such a major part of the theoretical conceptual work that's being done there is grounded in a space of, to use a word that's central to use, fabrication, and trying to fabricate, materialize practices of literary production and think through their, you know, the consequences, relations, and everything like that in the work, which is central. I mean, yeah, I want to acknowledge the fact that we're in Anteism Books, that we have our book series that comes out of the Center for Expanded Poetics here, and yeah, I mean, what is there a question in that? You know, like, I'm interested in the way that the space for thinking through these things opens up to all of these unexpected collaborations and processes of people coming together to materialize books and other media.
Yeah, well, it's been a fascinating experience for me to have my own ideas, you know, about trying to begin this research center, which are based on previous experiences of that kind of work, but also rather abstract, you know, before the practices themselves are set in motion. And, you know, we were talking on the way over here about, you know, how contingent the experience of collaboration can be, that one can attempt to form collaborations with various different parties or institutions or individuals or groups, and many of them don't amount to anything. On the other hand, you know, if you make that attempt often enough, some of them will really flourish into extremely interesting kind of adventures that you would never have expected. So the book series is one of those, and at the core of it actually is a printing technology, the risograph digital duplicator that we have at the Center for Expanded Poetics. And it's actually a kind of fascinating story, you know, the kind of relay between the beginning of the center and the acquisition of that machine, and then the development of our collaboration with Anteism and lots of other people. You know, I decided to get a risograph because a friend of mine, Alexei Kukulyevich, had used one to print an artist book of his, and he, you know, suggested that I get one. Once I did, it became a kind of hub of the Center for Expanded Poetics, because a lot of people in design, a lot of people in the arts wanted to use the risograph and would, you know, come and start collaborating with us, bringing their own ideas into what we were doing. Also, one of the students who I was working with right away at the CEP, Jessica Bebenek, has become a kind of risograph pro and expert, and she prints our book series. And then, interestingly, you know, Jessica's really invested in textiles, and in particular knitting, and was producing all of these knit poems. And I would never have expected when I started the CEP that textiles would become a sort of core component of some of the experimental practices going on in our work. But Jessica has really brought that to the foreground of what we're doing. And also become the printer of the book series. So the book series has been interesting to work on because it's such a collaborative process. You know, we're working with the writers, producing their texts. You and I are editing the series and, you know, conceiving of you know, different people who we might ask to contribute, or what we want the series to look like, what its priorities are. Then we have the printing of the book, the binding of the book by Anteism, and the distribution of the book by Anteism, or the books by Anteism. And sometimes that also involves gallery shows or interviews, and so all kinds of things have sort of sprung out of just the idea of starting a little, you know, book series, which is now 5 volumes in.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to transition to thinking about Baudelaire and your books that are coming out in the fall. And, you know, one of the things that I'm so thankful in the dialogues that we've had over the last number of years is your engagement with the long history of philosophy, of centuries of thought and literary practices. And, you know, I'm somebody who comes at poetry and poetics through a strange backdoor of the 20th century in terms of thinking of being interested in linguistics and linguistic philosophy, and then all of a sudden through these, you know, digital repositories like the Electronic Poetry Center and Ubu Web and Pensound and Craig Jorkin's Eclipse Archive, like I became, you know, interested in these poetries that you know, come up from the mid 20th century onwards with have a little introduction in theory and practice beforehand. But so any work that I do in the long history of philosophy, in the long history of literature, is always it's making up for things that I never engaged with initially. And rationalist empiricism was so exciting for me because I studied philosophy in my undergraduate, and was always overwhelmed by Kant and Hegel, and was brought into a study of these philosophers in such an incredible way through this book. And Baudelaire is in a lot of ways like one of the great writers of the 19th century, central figures to so much of modernity and modern literature, and so I know you have a translation of the Les Fleurs du Mal coming out, and also a book-length essay on Baudelaire, and I'm curious of how you came into this. What was it that was we have who is it that translated Les Fleurs du Mal, and it's the New Direction publications from the 70s.
Well, that's actually a collective translation.
That's
It's
right.
translations by all kinds of people.
We have Robert Lowell and all these different people translating Baudelaire in that.
Yeah, well, it's a good question how I came into these Baudelaire projects. I mean, I started, I decided to get serious about Baudelaire, read the poems more seriously than I had before. I'd been reading some theoretical, literary critical essays on Baudelaire, and got interested in some particular problems in the work. But then I didn't feel that that there was a translation in English that I could really work with if I wanted to write about Baudelaire. And then the more I read and talked to people, the more I found that was a kind of common experience. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to sit down and, at least for my own purposes, translate these poems so that I can quote them and so that I can work with them across, English and French. And as I started doing that, I did become quite obsessed with the project and decided to translate the entire volume. And I was interested in doing that. I was kind of inspired by Robert Duncan's translations of Nerval. Which are quite, let's say, there are a lot of false oppositions in translation theory, but they're quite direct translations. They're line by line. And I wanted a translation of Baudelaire that was like that. But then what I found once I started translating the work is that almost like the more direct one is, the more creative one has to become in the kind of minutiae of the semantic and grammatical decisions, because, obviously you cannot produce just a direct literal translation of any text, but that doesn't mean then that you should give way to just flagrant poetic license. I found that the more I constrained myself, working line by line, retaining punctuation, retaining a lot of structures of grammatical inversion, the more creative I had to become in my solution to local problems. And so then as I worked on the translation of Baudelaire, then obviously I just had these poems kicking around in my head for 2 or 3 years, and started thinking through how I could write a book at the sort of juncture of philosophy and literary criticism on Les Fleurs du Mal. And I went to do some archival research at the W.T. Bandy Center for Baudelaire and 19th Century Studies in Vanderbilt in Nashville. It's an incredible place.
It's amazing.
I really suggest going there.
It's amazing that the archives are there.
Well, it's not. Of course, there are a lot of archival materials at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, but this is an incredible archive on Baudelaire in Nashville that I don't think that many people know about. And so that was an amazing experience. And then the actual composition of the critical book, came together quite quickly. I'd written some talks, but then it was the beginning of the pandemic. And I was at the end of the academic year, and I couldn't go anywhere. All of the things that I had planned for the spring and summer were canceled. and I just stacked up all the Baudelaire materials that I had, and I sat down for 2 months, and I wrote this book. And I think because I'd been translating the book, the ideas were there.
Yeah.
And it was a unique experience for me of writing a book in that way. Normally it takes me quite a long time, in fact, to write a book, working between chapters and putting the thing together over, 5 to 10 years. And in this case, I was just able to write it in one continuous, bout of thinking and writing. And that was a real pleasure that was enabled, by the horror of the pandemic, but that also, I found myself in my apartment without much to do, and that was the way that I spent my time, and also dealt with the strangeness of that, radically new context.
It's fascinating to think of the Baudelairian figure of the flaneur who is like out in the world.
Oh, that is funny.
And
yeah.
the juxtaposition of
the quarantine.
of quarantine and yeah, I mean, so I mean, give me some kind of like what's the work of the book? Give me I recall the sort of frenzy in which you wrote it.
That's a good way of putting it.
I recall the strange hermetic period as well in which that frenzy is placed. But yeah, I don't know what the book does and what you're thinking through in it.
Well, the main concept in the book is poetic determination. So the subtitle is an essay on poetic determination. And there are sort of two senses of determination that I had in mind. One of them was just, the determination of the poem through the relationship between content and form. But even that, that opposition between content and form, when you're translating, you come to see, for example, so my translation is not rhyming and it doesn't follow a preset metrical scheme, but nor would I call it a free verse translation. Why? Because when you're writing free verse, the decision about where to break the lines, the breaking of the lines is so intimately related to the genesis of the content and vice versa. So those two things are co-implicating one another in the very process of writing. But when you're translating without a set metrical scheme, then the content, as it were, is already there. It's been written by, by the writer, and you are transforming it through the act of translation. But you don't really get to decide what the content of the poem is. You only get to decide what the translation of the poem is. So there's a way in which that sort of intimate bond between content and form can't be upheld by just maintaining a rhyme scheme or by maintaining a metrical scheme. And, the relation between those elements of poetic composition, which I think of as poetic determination, the way the poem becomes the thing that it is, the way the relationship between thinking and writing is composed and actualized in the process of composition. That's one way that I think about poetic determination. And that all, works in a very particular way that's different in translation than in the act of composition, but I was very much thinking that through. Then on the other hand, Baudelaire's poems and the whole framework of Les Fleurs de Mal is intimately bound up with the relationship between determining, being an agent, and being determined, or in Baudelaire's case, damnation, or also original sin. So the Luciferian figure is a key crux of this in Baudelaire. Baudelaire's romantic Satanism involves a sort of dialectic of defiance, of being a determining agent, of refusing to be determined, but on the other hand, then being damned and cast down through that very attempt to refuse determination and be determining. And that dialectic of determination runs all through the volume in these really interesting ways. Basically, the relationship between freedom and unfreedom that agitates so much of the book. So I tried to think about that conceptual and thematic component of the book in relation to the problem of poetic composition as the act and the actualization of the writing of the poem. And so that's what the book became about.
That sounds great. That sounds great. I mean, and it feels urgent too, because in the sense that I feel, as with Rimbaud as well, like in English, we always get this kind of dandified, gestural caricature in language of these poets, as opposed to like engaging them on their terms and their context and their engagement with language in and of itself. So that, I mean, that sounds fascinating, and I can't wait for it.
Thanks. Yeah, me too.
On that note, I wonder if we can end with. Would you want to read one of the translations of?
Yeah, well, this is a bit unexpected. So Michael suggested that I read one of these translations just before we got started today. But sure, I absolutely
I
can.
just thought
yeah.
it would be a nice way to close things off the dialogue as what we will experience in the future. That is that are these two books that lay up ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I can close by reading Baudelaire's famous sonnet,
Amazing.
analyzed by Roman Jakobson and Levi Strauss in a famous piece of structuralist literary analysis. The poem is Cats. So I'm just reading my translation. Fervent lovers and the austere sage love equally in ripe old age. They're strong and gentle cats, pride of the home, sensitive and sedentary like them. Friends of science and sensuality, they seek the silence and the horror of shadows. Erebus would take them as funereal envoys, if to service their pride would incline. Their contemplations take the noble postures of great sphinxes stretched in depths of solitude, who seem to sleep in endless dream. Their fecund loins are charged with magic sparks, and specks of gold, like fine sand, vaguely star their mystical eyes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you for this discussion. Thank you for the gift of your book and for everything.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your generosity and all the collaborations that we've been involved in. And thanks also to Anteism for hosting this event. And yeah, this has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And on that note, I'll be back here in 2 weeks, and maybe even Nathan will join. In 2 weeks, we're going to be launching, I'm going to grab it. We're going to be launching Amaranth Borsuk's new edited volume, the book 101 Definitions. Probably a number of you know Amaranth Borsuk's work. The incredible book, in addition to her incredible poetry, she has this book, The Book, that came out with MIT Press. And this is a sort of new exploration that came out with our document series, the book 101 Definitions. I'll be joined by the person who bound the book, the person who printed the book, Amaranth, and a number of people who have all from Steve Clay, Kate Greenstreet, Banu Kapil. There's incredible array of thinkers who are all involved in this book. And so a few of them will be joining us for that broadcast, which is in 2 weeks. And yeah, please join Nathan tomorrow. We'll put the link in the YouTube feed for the seminar on rationalist empiricism at Harvard tomorrow, and also the book launch. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Anteism for having us here, and to Yoav, Madeline, and Pascal for doing this incredible work broadcasting us. And yeah, have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.